you. My name is Ana Principi, and I'm the Undersecretary of Institutional Relations and International Cooperation at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences at the National University of La Plata. I would like to welcome you all to this, the third cycle of conferences we are holding as part of this new joint project between the USA and Argentina, shared dialogues on gender, ethnicity, geopolitics, history, and memory. This project is one of the beneficiaries of the U.S. Embassy in Argentina's grant program for the cooperation and exchange projects. The University of La Plata is extremely grateful to the Embassy for choosing and sponsoring this series of conferences. I'd particularly like to thank the specialists Noris Cerdá and Giselle Dubinsky for all their support and hard work during the preparation process. I particularly like to thank as well our Dean, Ana Julia Ramirez, Ana Barleta, Lucia Batista, Enrique Garden, Fernando Rigone, and Ignacio Angelani. At these events, 22 professors from the USA and Argentina will discuss and call into questions the connections and intersections between concepts such as ethnicity, class, feminism, testimonial literature, translation, decolonial turn and language teaching, geopolitics, history, and memory. This speaks of academic bonds, both previous and reinforced by this project, academic bonds and dialogues. This is in part the richness of these seminars. Today we will hear from Enrique Garden, and Brenda Elsie will introduce him. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm so excited to be back here again. Really appreciate it. What a wonderful project. It's really an honor to introduce Enrique Garden. He is professor of history at Universidad Nacional de La Plata. He is a member of the editorial board of Sociohistórica, Cuadernos del CISH, disculpa. He has co-edited with Sergio Vysokovsky 2 books on the middle classes, Moralidades, Economías e Identidades de Clase Media, Estudios Históricos y Etnográficos en Argentina y sus clases medias. Panoramas de la investigación empírica en ciencias sociales. Wow, those are real titles. Thank you. And with Alberto Pérez and Hernán Sorgentini, Formas del pasado, conciencia histórica, historiografías, prácticas culturales, memorias, publicado por La Plata también. So I'm really excited. Today he's presenting narratives of the origin and racialization of the middle class and national identity in Argentina. So without further ado, and I get to participate a little bit at the end. So I'm so excited. This research is amazing. And I say that not just because I share it. So Professor Garguin.
Thank you, Brenda, very much. Thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. I hope you can follow my poor English and without too much effort, and I will read most of the time, so I also hope not to bore you too much. I'm going to share the screen, if I remember. No, I'm disabled. Who can? Okay. Now I can. Yeah. Okay. Narratives of origin and the racialization of national and middle class identity in Argentina. The title may sound quite pretentious. I simply want to share with you some things that emerged from my previous research about the making of the middle class, which was mainly about the racialization of the middle class identity. So after this outline, I will begin talking about the racial articulation of a middle-class identity by mid-20th century Argentina, and that will be the first part of this talk. But a good deal of that research was actually about the making of a national myth, the myth of the European origins of the Argentine population, the myth that Argentines descend from ships. So the second part of this talk will deal with the myth of Europe in the River Plate. Finally, to conclude and illustrate some of the consequences of such a national construction, I would like to add a third part to this talk, made of some results of a more recent research, a work in progress that we are carrying out with Brenda Elsie here today with us. This research is about Afro-Argentines in the 20th century. It is about boxeadores de color, black boxers. Boxeadores de color is the way that some sport magazines name them. This will add complexity and fluidity to the previous considerations and will allow also to us to see what happened to those who did not fit into the excluding and homogeneous idea of nation that was being configured by that time and today. A national idea centered around a relatively inclusive notion of whiteness, inclusive for it allowed the incorporation of a wide diversity of ethnic origins and skin colors, but not so inclusive because it also found strict limits, leaving many people in the ambiguous position of being Argentines without belonging to the Argentine race. And bearing in mind that this last part comes from a joint research with Brenda, who happens to speak English quite well, Brenda will be in charge of this last part of the talk today. So if you wait, if you are patient, you are going to hear a good English. So let's go to the first part of this talk, the racial articulation of the middle class in Argentina. Very briefly, the first thing that caught my attention when I set out to study the making of the middle class was that the frequency with which it was said and repeated that Argentina was a middle class country since the beginning of the 20th century was not consistent. The contrast between these assertions and the overwhelming silence of the sources was shocking. During the first half of the 20th century, there was very little talk about the middle class in Argentina. It was practically not spoken. One does not find self-identifying middle-class discourses, not claims made from a middle-class position, as one can find easily in contemporary Peru, Chile, Brazil, or Mexico. Therefore, I put forward the following working hypothesis, that in fact, during the first half of the 20th century, middle-class identity was non-existent, or at least it was a very weak and fragmentary identity. Instead, the first half of the 20th century presented itself as a society that was thought of predominantly in a dichotomous way, with no much thinking about the middle class, no middle class institutions, no middle class discourses, and no middle class identity at all. In fact, a dichotomy people-oligarchy was the predominant way in which society was represented in public. And what today we might think of as members of the middle class were overwhelmingly included in the popular side in opposition to the oligarchy. So the middling sort of people, or the middle sectors by the early 40s, did not constitute a middle class nor have a middle class identity in any significant way. Instead, most of what we can describe as middle sectors consider themselves to be not only a central part of the people, but also the heirs of Europe and immigration. Thus, I have some other concept. Confronted with the disturbing irruption of Peronist workers within their space, within what they consider their space, they sought to differentiate themselves not only from the oligarchy as in the past, but also from the new Peronist other. And here is a draw from a Communist Party newspaper, which depicted Peron followers not as the people, but as pimps, prostitutes, criminals, etc., right? The lumpen proletariat. So a new Peronist other emerged in these constructions of Argentina. A racialized gaze played a key role in this process. The Peronist masses, with all their plebeian features overtly displayed in public, were almost incomprehensible within previous symbolic and cognitive structures, and were soon identified with new migrants from the interior of the country and objectified through a highly derogative and racialized term, cabecita negra, little black head. For most rising middle-class people, cabecita negra became tantamount to Peronist workers. Well, this is the famous photo of the people, the 17th of October of 1945, putting their feet in the fountain. This is the bird, the cabecita negra, the actual bird named cabecita negra. And this is a photo of a group of people from the north, Native Americans. They were mainly Aymaras and Quechua people who came to the city of Buenos Aires to ask Perón for land, etc. But they are images that represent this racialization of the other by white Buenos Aires. Such a racist reaction obviously suggests a deep sense of whiteness previously built in the making of a national identity and middle-class formation. Many scholars have unveiled the deep sense of whiteness implicit in dominant national imaginary for contemporary Argentina. Some of them even center their analysis on the middle class. Scholars have noted both the success achieved by 19th century elites' project of whitening population and the appropriation of European racial science by intellectual elites during the first decades of the 20th century. But what was the bridge between 19th century whitening projects, the explicit racism of early 20th century intellectuals, and the racialized class language of the second half of the 20th century? My hypothesis, then and now, is that the bridge was the dialectical process of white and middle class identity formation. Ultimately, what I want to stress, and what I believe is the key point revealed by my research, is that a strong, extended, and recognizable middle-class identity only emerged during Peronism and against it. And second, that such an identity was articulated with strong racializing tones. In other words, that it was during Peronism that the idea of a white and anti-Peronist middle class emerged from within the previous notion of the people. A people that had been constructed as white, but also a people that many could no longer consider one after the discovery of a Peronist working class that was considered neither civilized nor descended from the European shepherds. Hence, the possibility of a tripartite image of society appeared. Only then a highly heterogeneous group of social positions would be unified under the notion of a middle class, the notion that maintained the cultural and racial features previously imagined as characterizing and embracing the nation as a whole. The making of the middle class was a socioeconomic as well as a political and racial phenomenon. So again, some images that I think that made that graphical, right? The idea of the Fundación Eva Perón that was actually an opprobrious symbol of Peronism for middle-class people. Here the idea, el pueblo al poder, power to the people, and Susanita, who asked, what for? They are going to, they are going to leave everything dirty, plebeian stuff if the people is in the power. An idea that was not before Peronism circulating in the society. The people was the nation before Peronism. After Peronism, there was like a divide there. So that's enough, I think, about the middle class, because we are more interested in racialization, and we are going to link this with this idea. So in this second part of my talk, I trace the construction of the key element of the national idea, the one referring to its European roots. And it was inevitable to mention this. Our two last presidents made references to this idea of we Argentines are Europeans, right? Alberto Fernandez saying this unfortunate phrase that, well, we descend from sheep, but also saying that Mexicans came out from the Indians and Brazilians came up from the jungle. And before him, 2 years earlier, Mauricio Macri claiming that in South America, everyone are descending from Europeans, right? But the point is not we can make fun of this or we can criticize and we can become serious of this, but I think that the idea is that they exemplify a very widespread idea in Argentina. It was not casual that these presidents make this assessment. So it's enough for now. We can take them out here. Forget that they say that. But the idea is to show this, right? Like, I like to show how many actors, including our presidents, and including also artists, right? Vientos de Agua is an amazing series. It's now showing on Netflix. It's about immigration, but the idea is that we Argentines are immigrants working hard, experience social mobility and became middle class, etc., etc. And Lito Nevia's song, Llegamos de los Barcos, is actually the song that inspired Alberto Fernandez to say what he said. But we can also leave it there in blank. The idea, so, is that many people, even Scalabrini Ortiz, the nationalist writer of the 30s, he wrote about the man from Corrientes y Esmeralda, the porteño, the guy that go to the cafes in the center of the city. And for him, he was the paradigm of the Argentine, right? And he was a son of an immigrant. So there was many actors that created a partial and synthetic image of himself, the man from Corrientes y Esmeralda, the porteño, the people. A porteño image that socially and geographically extended became the archetypical figure representing the entire nation. This hegemonic construction, through which the average man from Buenos Aires was identified with the whole nation, resulted from two myths and made two parallel displacements. On the one hand, the myth of upward social mobility made class differences irrelevant by extending some people's experience of social mobility to the whole population. On the other hand, the myth of Europe in the River Plate projected onto the whole population the ethnic composition of overseas immigration, considering overseas immigration as homogeneously white and European, which was not. There was also overseas immigration which came from Asia or from Africa, right? So this myth of the European origins of the Argentine population is clearly linked to 19th century elite efforts to think of Argentina as different from the rest of Latin America. In Latin America, which had serious problems to fit within civilized societies according to the ideological tropes of the time. According to Tulio Alperindonghi, even during the independence period, the Rio de la Plata area saw a more complete consensus than other regions of Spanish America around the benefits expected from immigration, a consensus that only confronted partial and ephemeral hesitations and dissidencies. Together with the success reached by the pro-immigration projects promoted during the second half of the 19th century, such a lasting consensus encouraged the making of a national imaginary in which the European immigrants could not occupy but a central place. The idea of Argentina as a white nation, hence, can be traced back to the mid-19th century. Moreover, as Erika Edwards showed in the first conference of this program, whitening processes were on their way well before the establishment of the Republic and can be traced into colonial times. Yet, it was during the 20th century, under the impact of massive immigration, that the idea of Argentina as a white nation crystallized in quite undisputed myths of origin and achieved a common sense status. A common sense status clearly revealed in the unfortunate phrase, Argentines descend from ships. In fact, 19th century intellectuals recognized the troublesome quality of such an assertion, claiming the dominant character, not the exclusivity, of the white European component of the Argentine population. Using different devices, they tried to show that the non-white racial elements participating in the making of the Argentine race were either insignificant or subsumed under the dominant European one. Bartolomé Mitre, for example, claimed that the Rio de la Plata region had been different from the rest of the Spanish colonies since the very times of the conquest. In many aspects, the history of the Rio de la Plata region had been closer to the English colonies of North America than to the rest of Spanish America. In his view, Mesoamerica and the Andes were regions populated by semi-civilized peoples that had been conquered by rapacious and adventurous men, represented the most backward features not only from Europe, but even from Spain, which for them was the backwardest region of Europe, right? In Sarmiento, for example. The result had been the establishment of feudalism and a hardly desirable racial mixture. On the contrary, the Rio de la Plata had received the most advanced settlers among the Spaniards. True colonists in the sense of settling and civilizing, claimed Mitre, true immigrants, bringing with them civilization and a work ethic. He was talking about the colonial period, right? The colonizers. In addition, they had found neither gold nor vast indigenous peoples to master. The result had been the making of a rudimental democracy based on scarcity, work, and shared efforts. According to Mitre, the nation had begun its history linked to the most advanced notions of Western civilization. It was also better positioned in its racial composition. This is a phrase of Mitre in the history of Belgrano. Three races converged to create the physical and moral genesis of the Rio de la Plata's sociability. The European or Caucasian as an active component, the indigenous or American as an auxiliary one, and the Ethiopian as a complement. An original type resulted from their fusion. In this type, the European blood prevailed because of its superiority, constantly regenerating itself through immigration. Next to it, another mixed race of black and the white grew and improved, assimilating the physical and moral qualities of the superior race. Briefly, those were Mitre's arguments to conjure the ghosts of the inferior races and to justify his idea of a predominantly white and free Argentina. Such an intellectual construction, however, did not seem enough to be a white country, right? Hence, pro-immigration policies were planned as a way not only to civilize and populate the desert, but also to whiten the population, which was an implicit part and parcel of the civilizing project itself. The immigration projects underway since the mid-19th century were soon considered quite successful as regards both economic growth and the transformation of the country's ethnic composition, particularly in its littoral region. Here we can see how immigration numbers grew dramatically during the 80s, right? During the first decade of the 20th century and in the 20s, right? And the numbers were really dramatical. In relation to the receiving population, the impact was striking. Striking was the word I was looking for in my mind. By 1914, foreigners represented almost 30% of the population. In Buenos Aires, this figure rose to half of the population. Although in provinces such as La Rioja or Catamarca, foreigners made up only 2% of the population. So the impact of the immigration was huge, but it was also uneven, right? It did not touch the whole Argentina. Hence, Alberto Martinez, responsible for the third national census, can express with great satisfaction, or could express with great satisfaction. The foreign population has constituted and constitutes the main force and the first element of progress and work in the Republic. In a similar vein, Joaquín B. González claimed the Constitution has opened the doors of the land to all civilized men and ideas that import material and moral progress for Argentine society. We can see in both of these quotes and in many others, almost in every quote about immigration, that the immigrant representation link this figure not only with Europe, but also with progress, modernity, civilization, productive work. And the founding father of the Argentine Socialist Party could reinforce Mitre's ideas, claiming 1.5 million Europeans have arrived, who, united to the already existing element of European origin, form today the active part of the population. Remember Mitre talking about the active. Now, some races are active and other ones are passive, or I don't know, which will absorb the old Creole element incapable of moving by itself towards a superior social type. Creole, criollo is always an ambiguous word. Mitre used it as Spanish, Americans from Spanish origin. Juan B. Justo here appears to use it in the sense of a mixed race of Indians, right, of Native Americans and Spanish, which is another sense of criollo. Others, however, had serious concerns with the immigration, right? By the early 20th century, the problems the elites feared the most were no longer those linked to the racial inferiority of the population, but those growing out of massive immigration with its disruptive consequences for the quiet, village-like life they now longed for. Sorry, it's my dog. I can't. This was precisely what worried many intellectuals in the midst of the euphoric celebrations of the independence centennial. Much has been written about the nationalist reaction of the Centenario, but as Alperin again has pointed out, those nationalists neither denied immigrants' contribution to the population nor pursued to stop the immigration process at all. On the contrary, they sought to guide it in order to reach a national cohesion which they judged not only deficient but also more compelling than ever. By seeking to accelerate the foreigners' assimilation, they showed how deeply rooted was the perception concerning the important human contribution made by the immigrants. Hence, for example, the nationalist education promoted by Ramos Mejia was directed to the first immigrant generation, the most genuine child of an environment that is starting to take form, the depository of the future sentiment of nationality. He's a nationalist, he is concerned about the immigration's impact in the society, in the culture, and in the nation spirit, but he thinks there is a future. Through national education, we can make Argentines from the sons of the immigrants. After the centennial, however, there was a key change in relation to the 19th century liberal project. What the 19th century immigration advocates expected had already been partially attained and partially disproved. The whitening aspect of the project, in particular, seemed quite successful, at least on the surface. At the same time, however, it did not seem to be the expected panacea. From the state point of view, the enemies were not anymore the Indians nor the barbarian gauchos, but anarchists and socialist white folks. This situation may have weakened the absolute faith on immigration, but even chauvinist reactions proved to be unable to undermine the 19th century consensus about the generally positive outcomes of European immigration. In any case, the image of the Argentine population as overwhelmingly European was irreversible, and the interpretations of the 1914 national census only reinforced such a symbolic construction. Hence, by that time, a new consensus was built around the melting pot model. Its constitutive elements were already present in 19th century thinkers, but it became common sense in the 20th century, with an important variation. Since then, the crucible, or the melting pot, would only recognize as its components European immigrants and eventually criollos, but these criollos will be allegedly of European origin as well. In other words, by mid-19th century, the so-claimed white predominance went hand by hand with the recognition of its still troublesome nature, a whitening project, and the burden of different and conflicting interior provinces. Whereas by the 20th century, pro-immigration policies had already given some of the expected results, particularly in the littoral region. At the same time, the interior provinces, already defeated by the federal government, did not cause more political problems and were replaced in the elite's concerns by a new source of dissatisfaction, provoked in part by the cumulative effects of pro-immigration policies. From Buenos Aires, all Argentina was seen as a country of European origins, and the concern was no longer located in an internal racial other, but within a population considered as homogeneously white, even though ethnically diverse. "We are a country of immigrants," announced socialist representative Enrique Dickmann to his colleagues in 1924, a phrase tirelessly repeated like a mantra. I put it in Spanish because un país de inmigración, un país de inmigración, un país de inmigración, un país de inmigración is like a mantra. It's like now this, we descend from the ship, at that time was un país de inmigración, was like a formula, repeated everywhere. An immigrant himself, Dickmann added to this idea, "The Argentine country, this vast crucible of a new race, has brought here men of all races, the upper crust of human races. I am part of the Argentine crucible, the Argentine tree, deeply rooted in the native race of the country, its robust Iberian trunk, its implanted branches of all the most vigorous and intelligent races, and its blood sprinkled with a touch of Semitic ferment. It is reasonable to assume that with the most vigorous and intelligent races, or the upper crust of human races, Dickmann had actually in mind the European races. 20 years later, Dickmann himself clarified this point. Considering still alive the 19th century pro-immigration project, in 1946, he proclaimed the need to attract, as it happened in the past, a healthy and large immigration. As in 1924, he did not always make explicit the European he had in mind, but occasionally he did so. As when he promoted, he promoted the arrival and permanent settlement of a large and laborious European immigration. In fact, he used indistinctly, without semantic difference, notions such as all races or simply the immigrants, together with others that made explicit reference to Europe. Ultimately, Dickmann considered European and immigrant as synonyms, and he frequently erased from any consideration the native peoples. In America, he said, "We are all immigrants," like Macri. Macri is socialist, with the exception of native Indians that form a minority of the population. And he's talking of the America, right? Dickmann was not the only one thinking in this way. Augusto Bunge, for example, a socialist representative as well, considered Argentina as a country that has been enriched with the contribution of all the white nations of the world. Both Dickmann and Bunge were addressing anti-racist agendas. They were actually denouncing that there was some racism in Argentina, anti-Semitism particularly. The naturalized way in which they identify immigration with that coming from the European white nations confirms how deeply rooted was the identification of Argentina with immigration and European whiteness. Similar quotations can be abundantly found from diverse sources, but the given examples are enough to show the spontaneity of a discourse that took for granted the European origins of the Argentine population, achieving the status of common sense at least since the early 1920s. There were certainly some different voices denying immigrants a place in the making of nationality, but they did not manage to erode the emerging common sense. Moreover, they did not question the immigrants' contribution to the population, which was at the center of their concerns. They were precisely concerned because there was too many immigrants. They only rejected any spiritual involvement of the immigrant. Conservative nationalist Carlos Ibarguren, for example, Carlos Ibarguren stated, "The massive avalanche of immigrants has transformed Buenos Aires into a polyglot and heterogeneous region, a real chaotic ethnic Babel that has not promoted the formation of a spiritual unity, a proper Argentinian soul. This soul will emerge and will be powerful only when nationalism creates the moral and organic unity of all the social forces amalgamated in one only spirit. In a strict demographic sense, then, the crucible of races was apparent even for Ibarguren. And far from denying the white character of the Criollo population, nationalists and right-wing Catholics reproduced the same kind of courses against indigenous peoples and Afro-Argentine population earlier seen in the turn of the century liberal intellectuals. Revisionist historian Ernesto Palacio, for example, claimed that the Indians' contribution to Argentina had been null in cultural terms and very limited in demographical terms. We are a white nation, she asserted, an extension of Spain, of its race in America. And arguing against those who might have thought that there was something positive in native peoples, he quoted very disdainful phrases about the Indians from the gaucho Martín Fierro, the character of the famous poem written by José Hernández, and he explicitly stated that Fierro is not a mestizo. Not often was it the man of our pampas. He is white, and he is a Christian. He is a Spaniard, and as such, he is fond of the extermination of the tribes. I guess I can stop here. I think the selected quotations are sufficient to show the making of the discourse about the nation, which, with many roots in the 19th century, crystallized in the 20th century into common sense. At the center of this national identity, there was the assertion of the European origin of Argentina's population. Some agreed without second thoughts of the melting pot model. Others proclaimed instead the need to quick the immigrants' children's absorption of the Criollo national substance. To all of them, however, the search of a national definition during the first half of the 20th century took for granted the European foundation of Argentina's population. Certainly, such an extended consensus built a myth of origin with numerous exclusions. Asian, African, and indigenous ascendancy were by and large erased from the nation's representation. And it certainly represented some sectors of society better than others. The identification with Europe was constructed ignoring the population from the interior of the country and the least privileged sectors from the littoral. And this was done without any dent in the representation of a national community imagined as homogeneous. It could be a hybrid, but not a divided one. The idea of the white European nation seemed unshakable, though of course it was not. Whiteness was indeed naturalized, but as a social category shaped through multiple discourses, practices, and struggles, whiteness is also inherently contentious and contradictory concept. Racial categories convey a strong sense of tangible and visible reality, but at the same time, the fluidity or adaptability of racial discourse precludes a singular meaning or signification for the term. Being white or black, or criollo, indio, or mestizo is never a biological fact, but a social construction, sometimes more unstable than others, sometimes more clearly fluid and negotiable than others. Hence, and I'm giving to Brenda right now, what happened when a black boxer wins a gold medal for the white nation? And so we enter in the third part of this talk, which I leave with Brenda. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, and I understood everything. So now you can take an English break, and you can let me do this part. I think that's a great place to start then, because I love the idea of thinking through the rhetorical twists and turns of the late 19th and early 20th century, and then also thinking about a social history of how it affected athletes, particularly Afro-Argentine athletes in this period. So, I like, and methodologically I'm always interested in kind of taking that discursive analysis and going back and forth with the lives of people. And I think sports is really an ideal way to do that. Literally, boxers were supposed to embody particular values. And when they're representing Argentina at the Olympics, there can't be anything more obviously overdetermined than they were supposed to represent national values. So this is, as Enrique said, a work in progress. We're still writing this up and thinking it through. And it's exciting, and sports are exciting because you can see the discursive changes in action or consistencies, but also you cannot control everything about sports. Even if you cheat, even if you bet, there's a way in which you might wish someone to be better than they are. And there's an element of surprise all the time. You know, there's an element of, you can't necessarily control who's going to be the best boxer. And we're going to see that a lot of people in Argentina wished very much that that was a white person. And the fact that it wasn't has a lot to do with what we're going to see here. So I'm going to try to share. Yeah, I think I can share my screen. Thank you. That's enabled. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the research that we've been working on to explore the issues that Enrique has already talked about. I think you can see, okay. I might need to put this up because I can't remember how this works. It's okay. I'm sorry to cut off you.
Perfect.
Okay. Oh, no, it doesn't want to do that. Okay. Now you're just moving around my screen. Okay, perfect. So, yeah, I apologize for the obvious joke on the Argentine flag here, but I couldn't help it. This is then this piece of research that we have, the Lavelle brothers, a blow to the white European memory in Argentina. This is about this family, two brothers, and also their sons, or one of their sons. So we're interested in thinking about these boxers because, as I already said, sports is central to the construction of national identities in the 20th century. Myself and a lot of others have worked on football as kind of the obvious space for that. And there's a way in which comparison is really interesting. Eduardo Archetti, we're going to talk about his work a little bit. He obviously pioneered a lot of consideration where he looked at the links between ideas about national styles, rivalries, and masculinity. He doesn't spend very much time deeply thinking through race. And I think that's a little bit, of a lost, you can't do everything. It's a little bit maybe of a lost opportunity there. So we're looking to kind of revise historically the traditional narratives of how boxing was introduced in Argentina, which works a lot like historical narratives of sport throughout Latin America. There's a group of, elite white guys that bring modern sports, and then it's accepted and diffused by the general population. And we're interested because when we started to work on this, we found that there's actually a very important cohort of Afro-descendant boxers, both ones that you would consider to be Argentine and also foreigners, not necessarily immigrants, sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's a category, again, we're really interested in. Some of these boxers are coming from England or Panama or the United States. When do they get the assignment of immigrant or never? Going back to what Enrique was talking about with the idea of the purely European or white immigrant, and when are they constantly assigned the status of foreigners? These are some that then I just used boxers from abroad when I was translating it versus foreigners. And these are some that are, just fighting in Argentina that are from other parts, but have a really important part in building the media. Boxing itself was incredibly important in building a kind of sports community, a press. In that time, we think a lot about football and El Gráfico, and that's an incredibly important periodical, not only for Argentina, but for all of Latin America for Chile. It was constantly reading and repeating El Gráfico. It was in real conversation with Los Sports and in Brazil. And there's a lot more that's going on in terms of creating these sort of commentaries on race in sports. And then we found in the 19-teens and 20s very early on, and many of these were instructors. They were not just Afro-Argentine boxers that were active in this period, but also a variety that were teaching, that were playing, that were integral in that case of diffusion that is normally only given to white Europeans in the imaginary of who brings modern sport to Argentina. You know, is it Jorge Brown or his parents or whatever, his dad? I can't even remember the guy's name. But the idea that, you know, this is one person, and really as social historians, we never really believe there's one guy anyway, to be really honest. But the question is, why was there such a crucial group that then just gets forgotten? And how did this group generate more and more interest among Afro-Argentine boxers? And the ones that are an outgrowth, we believe, of this tradition are really the most famous, the Lovell brothers and the sons of Alberto Lovell, Anselmo Casares, the gentleman of the ring, El Mulato, Gabriel Peña, Ricardo Gonzalito Gonzalez, Raul Rodriguez. And so, you know, we're looking at kind of a group that we feel is in contact with one another, as well as white boxers, of course, as well. This is some of the early coverage. And Enrique, you can interrupt me if you want to comment on any of these slides in particular. Like, I don't need to. In the 1930s, then the Lovells were not only famous within Argentina and South America, but they were fighting all over the place. They were getting coverage in the United States, in the press in places like Mexico and Cuba that were very dedicated to boxing. So normally you would think, right, when we're thinking of like Firpo or some of these other people, that they would have gotten a considerable amount of attention with their success abroad. You know, that's part of what sports does. It allows Argentina to project a particular creative genius or athletic prowess, and that often that happens as people have success abroad. And so these are some of just the newspapers that we're looking through, and it's not very difficult to find the Lovells, right? Undefeated, as it says in this article, in American rings. So this was a person very familiar to the press in the United States as an Argentine boxer. Enrique, do you want to talk about this great picture over here?
Yeah, this is about, I don't remember now if it's Caras y Caretas or El Gráfico, but it was a story dedicated to him. I think it was when he won the South American Championship in 1938 or something like that. And he was the son of an immigrant from Barbados and descendant from slaves, and the daughters of the white Albion, said La Revista, right? She was an English, British, from British immigration. No, this is not his mother. This is the like a stepdaughter. No. His mother was white, was British white. One of the interesting things here is him cooking. One of the interesting things is he comes from a mixed marriage, we can say, but in his house they speak English. Both his father and his mother were English native speakers, right? And Alberto Lovell speaks English. When he enters the United States, the papers, the international papers, said that he speaks and writes in English. And one of the interesting things is about, well, what we consider in Argentina about an Afro-descendant, etc. He could never find a job related to his being bilingual. There was not so many bilingual people in Argentina. So when he couldn't continue boxing, apparently he worked for the police. And apparently he worked for the police as a tough man. Like, we don't have the sources exactly, but I mean, he could have another job probably, but he has to reach the lowest ranks of a job in the police as a tough guy, beating prisoners apparently. But here in this article, they tell the story of the Lovell as the story of a working man, struggling to get his way out of poverty, etc. It's a nice note. And this is a young girl that was adopted informally, I guess, by his parents. So it was like his sister, but not the blood sister. It was adopted. But she lived with them in the family.
Raised by his family.
Exactly.
And you know, it's even here when it says esta foto no fue inventada, like I mean, you wonder to yourself, what is it that is so shocking here? Is it that a boxer's cooking? Is it that a man is cooking? Is it that it's an interracial scene? Do they have to say that it's his sister so it's not sexually dangerous? It's, you know, there's a lot here to unpack, and I think neither of us is quite sure which is the most shocking inventación that you see in this. So I mean, it opens up a lot of questions, and he's really not identified as biracial. No. You know, there's not really such a category. So Enrique is right that very little is made of it. He doesn't, like, you know, the Browns or Watson go to these English schools where he could have taught. There's no reason. They didn't really all have fancy degrees necessarily either, but it's very clear that it's a racial hierarchy that's very firmly in place for him. And Enrique, do you want to?
Yes, this is like to put a contrast. How was considered? Because as we said, Alberto Lovell won the gold medal in the Olympics 1932, and his brother Guillermo won the silver medal in nothing less than in Berlin 1936, and when Jesse Owens broke every ideas of the Aryan white supremacy. And so they were quite successful boxers. They represented Argentina. They won medals for Argentina. But how they are represented in the media and the sports media, they are mainly forgotten. There's not too many mentions to them after 10 years they fought. But even then, how they appear, this is, I don't remember right now. Brenda? I think
this is El Gráfico.
Okay, maybe, but it's the same magazine. This photo is Peleadores de Antaño, right? And they put some of the supposedly important fighters of 10 or 20 years ago. And there are some important fighters like Gatica or Prada. By the way, Gatica and Prada were not more successfully in prizes, etc., than the Lovells. They were more famous, sure, right? But Alberto Lovell was gold medal, Argentine champion, and South American champion of the heavyweight, which is the most prestigious category, right? So here is not Lovell. It's not a Peleador of Antaño. He appears in another. You can show it, Brenda?
Yep. Here you go.
Which is Argentinos de Color. So Lovell was not an Argentine boxer, although it was, right? But it was an Argentino de Color. He was a black boxer. He was a boxeador de color. He was the pride of his race, not of his nation. Every time they talk about Lovell, they try to put it in a different category. He's Argentine. Nobody denies that. Nobody denied him to go to fight for Argentina in the Olympics, right? But then the recognition is always put in another category.
The race is emphasized first.
Yes.
It's always first. And then the sports media is very instructive. In case you didn't know, very few Black people were in Argentina. So it's, you know, it's a constant sort of repeating and you wonder to yourself, you know, how nervous are they about this memory? how sort of unsettling is it that they have to be sure that you're not concerned? Let's make sure the readers know, even though we have all these black boxers here, right, that we're pointing out that this is very uncommon. Very, very uncommon. So it's interesting how they're constantly, instructing the reader, about what to think and directing them in regards to the images. Do you want to say anything else about this one?
No, maybe if you go to the other one, I think it's the one that is Guillermo Lobel. It's a poster. Yeah.
This one. Let me move our thing so you can see it better. Yeah.
It's okay. And you translate it. This is a poster published by Cancha. It's a magazine, I think, from the 50s or 60s, right?
Yeah.
When Guillermo Lobel was probably forgotten. And they talk about the Olympics of Berlin, and there's a photo of Guillermo Lobel. Here is Guillermo Lobel, but simply a heavyweight boxer. They didn't say he won the silver medal, right? And there's another boxer that was nothing, but they say he reached to the semifinals or something like that, and was less successful than Guillermo Lobel, but is enhanced because he's white, right? And another surprising thing is there's here a nota in the newspaper La Nación in 2001 that they talk about Guillermo Lobel, and they say they fight without success in the Olympic Games of Amsterdam 28. In Amsterdam 28, he was like 10 years old, I think, because he went to Berlin with 18 years. So he was 12 years old. So they didn't know when he fight, and they didn't know he won a silver medal. So I think that is overwhelming, the burden of a black boxer as an Argentine boxer in the symbolic representation of Argentine sports and Argentine national identity, etc. Right?
And the other thing that's strange, I mean, for Argentina, who is very famous for feeling in its sports culture and sports journalism that it's constantly persecuted, there was a lot of argument about if he should have gotten the gold, right? I mean, in 1936, there's like an argument that maybe the decision, right, or whatever, the ref doesn't, I can't remember what it is exactly, but there's a kind of debate there. And you would think if it was any other sport in Argentina, they would be like, he deserved the gold. And this was a very important Olympics. Again, Jesse Owens, most Argentine sports fans would know that name more than they would even know this one. So we were very surprised about how we knew it was kind of repressed memory in sports, but I think we were both surprised as we began this research, the extent to which modified on advertisements in this period. We see this all the time. Nestle, there's different advertisements that are circulating around. This one says, children from a tender age that are fed with harina lacteada Nestle and later eat the famed chocolates con leche Nestle, build their health, strength, and vigor to defeat sickness. So it's almost like he's defeating sickness and defeating the kind of sickness that the world champion is suffering from, Niño Nestle.
And this was a publicity of Nestle that was constantly repeated about defeating sickness, but this was in January 1915 when actually Jack Johnson was in Buenos Aires. So they made the publicity of the Niño Nestle beating Jack Johnson. They don't put his name, but they say the champion, the world champion or something like that. So this is also about the general representation of blackness in Argentina and the blackness in sports. There's tons of the derogatory forms of representing blackness in Argentina. And this because one interesting thing about the black boxers is that sport magazines in Argentina have a great representation of black boxers generally, globally, right? They did not deny that the black people are great boxers, right? But in Argentina, there's a problem. But what we find also is that together with that recognition that great boxers are black, is always an insidious way to signal them as morally inferior, or they always have something wrong, right? So we find many quotes that point on that direction. I think here we have some. I don't know if it's worth to mention them, but that is the idea, and it's very contrasting with the way they represented white boxers. This is El Torito de Mataderos. Everybody knows El Torito de Mataderos. Justo, ay, se me fue el apellido. Justo Suárez. In some part, one of the magazines said the unforgettable Torito de Mataderos, no? And one thing, how we are going to forget him if we are every number of the issue of the magazine you mention him. Nobody can forget him, right? So there's a song by the Cadillacs, there's a short story by Cortázar about Justo Suárez. Justo Suárez was contemporary to Alberto Lobel. I have to say he was less successful than Alberto Lobel, although he was more famous at that time, right? But again, why was he more famous? Was that completely not related with race? I doubt it, right? It's hard to say, but
well,
everything pointed out to that.
Look at the way in which Jack Johnson is always being portrayed as spending too much money, being too luxurious. That's always his downfall as a Black boxer. But here, you know, this is celebrated, right? He's fashionable and he's successful and he deserves that as a working class person. But when Black men do it, it's much more threatening. And we know this from like the work of Teresa Runstetler on Jack Johnson and race, right? It's like an excessive amount always. That's the downfall of the Black boxer, and we see that again and again and again. Do you want to take this one?
No, I think it's the
just
same.
more, yeah,
Suarez,
it's just more of Justo Suarez.
Yeah.
He's incredible. He's
friend
amazing.
of everyone. He had
Yeah.
an Afro-American coach, like Satan, and he died in poverty of tuberculosis, TBC, right? So it is like, as Brenda just said, like the paradigmatic story of a poor people who grow economically boxing, fighting, and then die in disgrace. But because he is the friend of everyone, that we celebrate that life. If he were Black, we would say there's moral deficiencies in Black people that drive them to that road, to that.
And if we had tons of time and all the attention in the world, we could compare that with the way in which Brazilian football players were being treated by the Argentine press in this same period. And we would find that these things connect, right? Like when Black players try to negotiate their salary, for example, then the salary negotiations are how greedy, you know, after 1934, how greedy, how could they not care? They're not doing the job for the purity of spirit. So a lot has to do with money. And that goes back to Enrique's part, I think, about class and how you kind of ground in which races deserve to have social mobility and which should just be grateful to be playing. And I think there's a big difference there. There's another one we make between Lovell and his teammate in Berlin, El Pibe Casanovas. This is from El Gráfico, the figure of Casanovas being as Argentine as any of them, occupied a special place. His triumph is the triumph, quote, of all of us who love Argentine boxing and see it so brilliantly represented in this handsome blonde boy with clean and elegant action, technical and brave at the same time, you know, waxing poetic about the Pibe Casanovas. Then we looked at different quotes. This is, again, you know, we're just trying to develop this, the ways in which they're talking about these extra spectacles, which is when you take a white fighter and a Black fighter. And there's several instances that we try to compare here. Do you want to talk about the race science like, you know, one of...
No, I think there are more examples of the uneven way of treat white or black boxers, right?
Yeah.
This color scale was funny, but it's one more of the many.
I know, it's just there's a mountain of evidence about it. And there's always an exceptionalism sometimes, right? That links back with color, like Anselmo Cáceres. They find something nice about Anselmo Cáceres, which is, oh, he's like humilde, and he's then as humble as his color. So there's a connection between whatever quality they have, which doesn't come from them being Argentine or representing Argentine people, and again being like intimately connected with his Black community, which is not a recognized community again.
No, and it's also the idea of the house slave, right? His humility, humble, obedient, all that stuff. And he was a great boxer, and he then taught boxing in some clubs on north of Buenos Aires, but that's a different way of naming him.
Yeah. Okay. And so here we have in 1951, so a good deal after we think about also these discourses that last and sort of permeate. Here we have a celebration of Jesse Owens. And here it seems that we have a real whitening taking place in photographic evidence. It's hard to say for sure, but I would say the poster is pretty similar, right? Doesn't it take the same, I think, I think if we look at the poster, right here, you see almost always a similar position here. It would not catch your eye if you were just looking. You wouldn't say, oh, look, both an Argentine international success and a Black boxer, right? It would just, it's very, the colors kind of washed out here in any case. And you have Jesse Owens, Olympic champion, who is, of course, remembered as being very resistant to Hitler's race science. And it's just appalling the way in which, I don't want to be too repetitive, but I can't tell you enough how it's like, wow, okay. Interesting. So I think this is just what we're going to, conclude or wrap up with. We had a few things so far that we're interested in applying this case of the boxers to the kind of wider cases of racialization in the middle class. And one, we're looking at the highly paradoxical position of Blackness in the Argentine racial formation. Also looking at the way in which the larger sporting landscape knits together the labor and the culture of Italian and Spanish immigrants while defining Blackness as foreign, particularly Brazilian. And here I'm not just talking about boxing, but I'm talking about football as well, right? If there are Black football players, they're frequently assumed to be Uruguayan or Brazilian, even if they're neither. And when they are, their labor isn't really sort of hinted at. So it's like, if they're considered to be hardworking, they're not compared to their origin story. It's kind of like, oh, Argentines came off of boats and immediately started working, and Afro-Argentines appear from the sky and have no labor. But it's rare that they talk about them. We did want to look at the Lovels and the whitening process as a way to limit its success. Do you want to take the last points here?
I can just read it.
Okay, you can just read it.
In the case of los Lovell, their racialized marking make it difficult for them to be recognized as representatives of the entire social body of the Argentine people. They can fight for the nation, but they do not fully represent it. None of them became the globe of the nation. Globe of the nation, guantes de la nación, is an archetype phrase for other boxers, successful boxers, like representing the entire collective nation. And the collective memory does not include them among its notable athletes. Lovell was always the name of a Black boxer rather than an Argentine one. And I think that it's a graphic image of the whole talk, right? Of the making of a white nation, which we can recognize some contributions of other peoples, but at the end, they are not quite fit on the Argentine nation. So there's an ambiguity, of course, right? There's many studies also of how the people in Argentina has many blackish characteristics, right? Like in Peronism, and also in the late 19th century, Buenos Aires had a huge Afro-descendant population, and most of the electors, for example, were from the Afro-descendant population in Buenos Aires. The immigrants didn't vote, so and the popular sectors were descended from slaves, etc. There was an organized community, Black community. So there's many ideas of the Blackness of the popular culture in Argentina, tango, the influence, etc. But that recognition stops always at some point. And one of those points is if you are you have too many attributes, phenotypical attributes of Blackness, right? That do not include you in the Argentine population. Okay, that was all. I don't know if there are questions. With Brenda
Not
sharing
yet.
the talk, we have no. Well, Lucia Batista says, buenísimo todo. Thank you, Lucia.
I love it. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yes, I saw it here, there.
Yeah.
Hello everybody. Hello Enrique, Brenda.
Hello, Ana.
Hola.
Anna. I been a little bit late, but I could follow everything, and it was very interesting and suggestive. The lecture, both lectures. It was very well. Brenda said wonderful. It was for both. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Illustrative with all those examples. Very nice.
And Rodrigo González Arcumano said, excelente cierre, excellent closure. Thank you.
Thank you,
It's
Rodrigo.
right.
There are many comments. Excellent, very nice, very good.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
We think
you
it's
all.
interesting. It's new. It's interesting. You know, again, you don't want to like repeat, like sometimes when we gave this talk at LASA, a different version when we first started working and something similar, right? You don't want to heap on a million examples of look at this, but it is startling, you know, the mountain of evidence kind of is suggestive.
Overwhelming.
It's
Yeah.
appalling.
Yeah. Thank you.
Tamara said wonderful, very good. Thank you all.
I learned a lot today. Thank you all so much, Angie.
Yes.
Thank you, Angie.
Thank you.
But questions? Are there any questions? Answers, maybe?
I imagine an interesting question.
Lucia said something. Recién hoy entendí a qué refería la canción El Matador de
me
los
too.
Cadillacs.
Yes, but
Well,
there's another song that is
yeah.
no, it's not the Cadillacs, it's the Pericos.
Right.
The Pericos says well, I don't remember now how it is sung, but there's a song about Justo Suárez.
Natalia says thanks. It was very interesting. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it.
And I think,
Yeah.
Brenda, you had to leave, right, or not?
I'm sorry, I have to go get a child.
No, it's okay.
But this has been so wonderful, and thank you so much. I hope this project continues. This is, you know, really
Yeah.
good stuff.
We hope
Yeah.
so too.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was an honor to participate.
And thank
I
you,
love
Brenda,
Embajada.
helping me with this talk.
No, it's great. I mean, you're much better at kind of larger issues and
No, but after half an hour of that was English, I don't know.
no, totally. I understood
I am tired.
everything. It's exhausting. Agotada.
Yeah, but you know my English.
Yeah, well, it sounded a lot better than it is. So
Okay.
your English sounded way better than what you think. It was totally
Thank you.
intelligible. It was fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you all.
Zoom.
Thank you all. And Lucia says,
Algo que Torito de los Pericos, claro, ese.
Yeah.
That's one.
nice. So thank you, Enrique Garden, again. Really
Thank you,
excellent,
Ana.
brilliant. Well, see you all tomorrow.
Okay.
Talking
yes.
about gender with Alejandra Berti at 6 p.m. as well. So see you tomorrow.
And next Monday with Tema Kaplan, right?
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And
Okay.
Bonnie
See you
Smith
tomorrow.
on Thursday.
Perfect.
So
So see you then too. Thank you very
see
much.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.